Greetings and welcome back to another edition of MGTOW Talks. We are here once again with our friend Coltane to talk about essentially animal ethics, but it does come within a certain context, which is to say the fairly recent events that occurred at the Cincinnati Zoo, whereby a certain gorilla was shot due to a child managing to make its way into the enclosed area. It's been controversial, and it's actually managed to escape the borders of the United States in terms of news, and it's become international news. So I'll let Coltane, in fact, narrate the specifics of the events, and we're going to launch into it after that.
Well, I guess the few things that we'll probably go over are human life, the idea of human life sort of trumping everything else, so human life over ape life. Also the fact that the gorillas are critically endangered, and the legal standing of non-human life, I guess. So I guess the background of the event, to the best of my knowledge, the child apparently, there are reports that from bystanders that said that they heard the child telling the mother that the child wanted to go and swim in the water inside the cage, and the mother just wasn't paying enough attention. Child got in there. Basically, the gorilla was, I think they got the other two gorillas, they were able to coax the other two gorillas out of the enclosure. But the third one, the male silverback Harambe, kind of went to see what was happening and kind of grabbed the kid and dragged the kid through some water. And then after that, it kind of looks as though the gorilla sort of helps him stand up and dusts him off and fixes his clothes up and stuff, and he's just standing there, after which the gorilla was shot. There's a couple of different conflicting interpretations of what the gorilla was doing there. There's one article from a zookeeper saying that the gorilla was actually positioning the child and kind of standing over it to kind of show the crowd that it was in charge. And there's another interpretation by a primatologist that was actually saying that the gorilla was just curious and, wasn't looking to harm the child simply for the fact that the child posed no immediate risk to the gorilla. So I guess...
Or its harem. I mean, ultimately that is the role of the silverback, is to protect his harem.
Yes. But I guess that is just to start with, that is a big question as to whether or not lethal force was justified against the gorilla. Obviously, the zoo took the position, and I suppose we should say from the outset that most of what we talk about here is, ethical what-ifs and hypotheticals. Legally
right.
speaking, the zoo, if the zoo hadn't have acted the way it did and the gorilla killed the kid...
Yeah.
There'd be...
Exactly. I wanted to talk a little bit about this because it is fairly relevant. No matter what the zoo might actually think, in some strange shape or manner, what they did was an act of political correctness.
Yeah.
It may very well be the case that, I don't recall the head of the zoo's name, but the director of the zoo's name, but he said something effective, if we had to do it again, we would. Mm. It's the same thing as, vetting, a certain number of people to fit into the quota systems. Like, well, we're doing the right thing.
Yeah.
It's entirely possible that, everyone thought, no, we should have tranquilized the gorilla, we should have done X, Y, Z, everything different. But the problem is, the two possibilities. One, had they just tranquilized the gorilla and nothing had happened to the child, the public would have been outraged, the majority of the public, rather, not all of it, would have been outraged because, how can you protect a gorilla's life over a child's? Alternatively, if for some strange reason the child had come to harm, the zoo would have been liable. And so basically the zoo was covering its hide. It's, certainly for the people who had a relationship with the gorilla, the zookeepers, etc. It's probably quite a sad event. They are our third closest relative after bonobos and common chimpanzees. So I have no doubt that you can develop a relationship, as Dian Fossey, in fact, did back in the day with gorillas. But the zoo is just covering its own hide. And this is an element where, yeah, absolutely, we're talking about hypotheticals here, because there are practical considerations that have just nothing to do with ethics here. What the zoo did, it's almost as if it's outside the realm of the ethical, just because if it hadn't acted the way it had acted, they would have been fucked up the goat's ass, as I like to say. Would you not agree?
Yes. However, some of the hypotheticals, like a good place to start might be the great ape personhood movement, the movement to grant the great apes, our closest living relatives, some type of legal recognition of personhood. Obviously, the whole thing, I'm always sketchy on using the term animal rights, because rights usually come with some a right is a collective agreement of how things should be, and it usually comes with obligations as well. So we grant you the right to drive, but you also accept the responsibility of understanding and following the road rules. So, for example, we couldn't grant a chimpanzee the right to drive because a chimpanzee wouldn't understand the road rules, for instance. But we could, I guess, grant. I guess with this great ape personhood movement, it's some type of recognition that they're closer to us than most other
special benefits, maybe.
Special benefits. I kind of think it would be similar to the way like disabled children are treated, for example. They are like a disabled person with like severe
mental retardation.
Yeah, cerebral palsy or something like that. We recognise that they have personhood, but they also don't have the full spectrum of autonomous rights that other people have, just for the fact that they can't comprehend the obligations that go along with that. So hypothetically, if great apes were granted personhood, and the kid's in the cage with the gorilla, and you recognise that the gorilla is legally a person, what do the ethics then become to just arbitrarily shoot the guy on the off chance that there might be harm befall the child? You probably, like, looking at that vision, if there was a big disabled guy standing over the kid, just kind of looking around and not seeming to pose any immediate threat, it probably wouldn't. The police probably wouldn't just arbitrarily gun down a disabled guy for standing next to a kid.
Perhaps. Although, I mean, to be fair, there are two elements here. The average male silverback is approximately 10 times stronger than your average human male, which is, of course, that's strong. I mean, they could tear people in half, quite literally. The other thing is, it's a question of perception. I mean, as we've been doing this for a while, we are apes too, but most people don't walk around thinking themselves, well, I do, of course, I'm a thinking ape, but most people don't walk around thinking of themselves as apes, per se, and therefore we have a very deep evolutionary relationship with gorillas. It's not how they think. They see a big, black, silverback, hairy thing and a human, and that's, I mean, fuck, we can't even get ethnic tribes to get along within humans, let alone, I mean, how are we going to get that done? So, whilst I largely agree with you, I think we're, once again, maladapted and lack a kind of, I guess, intellectual and ethical sophistication, by and large, majoritarily, to look at a situation that you just presented and say, yeah, that makes sense. I agree with you for the most part. It's just that that's not how people react on a visceral level. They just see, big, hairy monkey man.
And I suppose as I mean, we could even narrow it down even further, even within the confines of our own species. I mean, we've both spoken about this previously, is that, woman hits a man, he probably did something wrong. Man hits a woman, he's a monster. Like, it doesn't, the context, the kind of innate biological assumption of man bad, woman good kind of trumps the actual facts of the case. We had a court case here recently in Australia where a guy killed his wife, and the High Court of Australia essentially ruled that it didn't fit the legal definition of murder, and that the charge was manslaughter, and which in Australia carries the same legal sentence. Like, you can get basically a life sentence for manslaughter in Australia. We don't have first and second degree murder, so manslaughter is kind of considered second degree murder in Australia. And there were literally thousands of people protesting in the street that the Supreme Court didn't charge this guy with murder. So even within our own species, I think we see a similar sort of thing between men and women. So yeah, I mean, I doubt you go even further to gorillas. I mean, I doubt that even if they were granted personhood, it would still have probably played out the same way that it did. But in a pure hypothetical scenario of ethics about what should have happened and how gorillas should be treated, I personally think that the gorilla should have been tranquilized.
No, I agree.
I don't think they.
There is some wiggle room, though. I think you could still, even within the context of what actually happened, you could insert a bit of you can insert some ethics here. For example, I think it was extremely negligent of the mother and the zoo, which, I mean, let's face it, the gorilla is effectively the property of the zoo. Who knows how expensive that property was? Now, people might not like the term property, but that's effectively what the silverback was. Her negligence led to effectively to the death of the gorilla, and she should be, I think, charged criminally, or at least fined very heavily for that.
I think
to show
it was
that
criminal negligence.
Criminal negligence, well, however you wish, the type of negligence you wish to term it, the fact of the matter is the zoo lost a valuable possession, and normally in a legal situation, if you, apart from the criminal activities, if you go to someone's home and trash lots of things, their property, it's quite possible that in addition to the crime that you committed, maybe you won't even necessarily go to jail, but you'll have to reimburse them. It's probably outside the financial scope of the woman, but she should at the very least be investigated for her record of looking after children. Did you not mention, for example, that she actually works as a daycare assistant or a daycare worker?
She's an administrator at a Cincinnati daycare center, which
Right.
is one of the things that I was sort of. I've discussed the event with a couple of women that I know, and they seem to be bending over backwards to make excuses for why this woman wasn't paying attention to her child. One of them being, she's got 4 kids. You have no idea how hard it is to keep an eye on 4 kids. And
in addition to that, they're blaming the father, who wasn't even present at the event. He wasn't even at the zoo.
No. But I mean, I look at it and I'm like, 4 kids, I'm sure that is difficult to handle, but all that really tells me is that she has more kids than she can safely care for. And one of them was put in a rather precarious, dangerous situation because of it, and there's now a dead gorilla. And I basically, a lot of the women that I've spoken to, a couple of them actually have kids themselves, and several of them said the exact same thing to me, which was, if it was my kid in there, I'd shoot the gorilla myself. Which,
right.
I mean, again, there's a reason in law, for example, why we have the mother. If it was your kid, you don't get to be on the jury either. Trying to make that argument like trying to turn it from an objective situation into a subjective one, I don't think is really a great argument in shooting the gorilla.
I mean, this just goes to show how people, specifically women, just tend to argue from visceral emotion. They're not thinking about the larger hypothetical ethical concerns here. And it's...
Well, I only thought about this after I'd spoken to them, and I actually wondered if their perception would change if we gave them a new hypothetical. Because they're all, like, every single one of the women I spoke to tried to basically let the mother off. Like, they're all, accidents happen, kids are hard to look after, mama bear protecting a cub or whatever. But I sort of think about it like this. I'm like, what if, she works in daycare, what if it had been someone else's kid that she'd been charged to look after? What if it was your kid that she was supposed to look after, she didn't pay attention, and your kid ended up in there because of her negligence? Would you expect her to be charged then? I suspect that in that situation, if it wasn't her kid, if it was somebody else's kid that she was professionally paid to be caring for, there would be calls for her to be charged.
Yeah, I think so. Unfortunately, people, we're getting into the whole genetic relatedness thing. People tend to be very biased towards their own children. This is something I've always found fascinating as a type of alien myself. Parents apparently in a state of wonder and just bemusement at their child blowing spit bubbles out of their mouths. I mean, this is not a prodigious feat here to the objective observer, and yet the parents think this is the most amazing thing since sliced bread.
Yeah.
And I think this is just this whole issue of being sort of blinded by one's genetic relatedness. And you see this in the same example of the women that you were discussing with this issue with, saying, well, if it were my kid, I would do X. I would have shot the gorilla instantly. These are people just operating on this visceral instinct that most people do. They're on autopilot, right?
But that's the thing I find interesting, is that they were all making excuses for this woman on the basis of, if it was my kid and I was the mother, I would shoot the gorilla. But I just wonder how their perception would change if it was, it's your kid, but it's her that wasn't paying attention to it. Would you expect her to be charged? I think changing, like keeping that genetic relatedness, but actually shifting the blame there would actually change their perception.
I believe so.
How
and certainly
legally treated,
administrator or not. I mean, imagine if as a worker at a daycare center, you took the children out to a zoo, like Cincinnati Zoo, for example, and one of them managed to sneak its way into the enclosed area. Certainly, not only probably the gorilla would have been shot again, but the person, the daycare worker who was leading the people around, the children around, would probably be charged for some sort of criminal offense, I would imagine.
Yeah, or sued by the parents at least
as well. Yeah. It's kind of, I mean, this seems to fall into, and I know we hadn't planned into talking about this, but this whole idea of parents having a kind of omnipotent power over their children. I mean, of course, there are limits. In many cases, the state intervenes when a child is, say, being savagely beaten or abused, or, I mean, there's some really extreme cases on record. The famous one that, unfortunately, psycholinguists study is the case of Jeannie in California in the 70s, who never never acquired English because she was kept in a cellar on a chain, I believe.
And she never developed any language, did she?
That's of course what I meant. But she never developed English because she was in California, English-speaking country. That's what I said anyway. So I never acquired language, to be precise, but never acquired English, and I mean, she was way past the critical period by then. And of course, then people intervened, but it's a question of, obviously, some people who don't like state intervention would like this, but at what point in time does the state, given the state of affairs, intervene? Is you believe it's criminally negligent? I certainly think it's negligent. Should she be investigated? Well, possibly. and certainly she caused damage to the zoo, and she's essentially getting away scot-free, largely in sympathy. There were, animal quote-unquote rights protesters, and there's another sort of extreme spectrum, of course, of people who think that...
I actually just want to add here, I don't even think she's just getting away with it. I think she doesn't even comprehend her own sort of the extent to the problems that she's actually caused. I saw one quote from her on a news article that actually read, God protected my child until the authorities were able to get him. I mean, God didn't do anything. This is on you, lady. I don't even given quotes like that. I don't even think she comprehends the.
She probably is not the brightest person. I mean, statistically, intelligent people tend not to have 4 children. The smarter, more educated people, when they have children, only tend to have 1 or 2 maximum. So she's probably not that bright, especially making that reference to God. That's a strong indication that she's not a particularly intelligent person. So she's probably not even in a position to understand her liability in this, or for that matter, the damage she caused to the zoo. I mean, there is another spectrum of people who are just absolutely insane when it comes to issues of quote-unquote animal rights, who think that, rats have the same status as human beings and what have you.
A guy actually got angry at me in the talk that I did with Tildeer, where I said, pregnancy is nothing special, like even rats can do it. And yeah, there was a guy in the comments section that doesn't appear to be a troll or a po. Like, he actually seemed legitimately offended that I'd prefaced the worm rat with even. So he's like, what do you mean even rats can do it? Rats are creatures just like us. They deserve our respect. I'm like...
That's incidentally one of my favorite Colting quotes of all time. Hell, even rats can do it. But, and I think this leads very nicely into something we've talked about privately on occasion, a kind of hierarchy of ethical concern with reference to other animal life, since we're animals as well, based on neurological complexity. To me, it makes sense that we should be less concerned about a rat than a border collie. Yeah. And it makes also sense that we should be less concerned about a border collie than a bottlenose dolphin, for example, because of the complexity of their brains, essentially.
Yeah, well, speciesism definitely exists along a spectrum, I think. I actually knew a zookeeper at one point who offhandedly made the joke once that if you work in zoology, you have a basic understanding that if you don't have a vertebrae, you don't have rights.
That's an excellent way of putting it. Yeah.
Yeah, which is kind of like if you think about it along a spectrum, even animal rights people don't seem to have too much of a problem swatting a mosquito that bites them.
There are some extremes. Your friend, the Banana Girl, would disagree, but
you have groups like the Jainists who wear fly screens over their faces and sweep the footpath so they don't tread on ants and stuff. I mean, you're talking extreme levels of crazy here, but it's one of those things that...
And extreme vegans as well.
Yeah, but we for most people, there kind of exists an almost natural tendency towards certain animals being considered more important than others. One of the things that I've noticed is that we can eat sheep and pigs and cows and things. The animals that we seem to get quite upset about when they're mistreated or killed are puppy dogs and cats and things like that. Playful creatures.
Neotenous creatures.
Well, I was just going to say, yes. Large eyes, small nose, playful. Basically, creatures that we can almost see the neotenous features of human children in. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why, we see a lot of ourselves in chimpanzees and gorillas too.
Certainly. I mean, if anyone who's taken the time to look, I've been to zoos before to see the expressive features, or even on a video like orangutans. There's certain sort of conservation projects there and how they interact. that they seem, almost human-like. And certainly that's a kind of instinctual misleading. It was not to say, I'm a big fan of the great apes. We're a great ape too, but you look at, speaking of neurological complexity, it can easily be argued that cetaceans, in particular toothed whales, dolphins such as orcas and bottlenose dolphins, are quite literally more intelligent than other apes apart from human beings, and in some ways have a more developed limbic system in terms of emotional processing. So they're in terms of neurological complexity, they're more complex than chimpanzees and gorillas, yet they look so alien and strange, and so we don't really have that same feeling towards them.
I think orcas in particular, there is it orcas or bottlenose dolphins who are second to us on the encephalization quote?
Or orcas.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm going to quote Laurie Marino here, who is actually, I should introduce this particular incident because it's kind of related. So, I don't know if anyone's familiar with this film Blackfish. It was a documentary film of a killer whale that essentially went mad from depression and mental illness and killed a trainer. Killer whales have never, ever been documented to attack or kill anyone in the wild. It's only happened on a few occasions in closed areas. Now, a question, I'll read this off. She's basically a marine psychobiologist who studies dolphin brains. Question posters: what are some characteristics that set killer whale brains apart from human brains? In Blackfish, you and other scientists mention that a particular area of the orca brain is enlarged. Quote, if you look at the limbic system, the emotion processing area in all mammal brains, you find something really interesting. There's some parts of the limbic system of dolphins and whales that have changed and actually gotten smaller, but there are other parts of it that are adjacent areas that are much larger and more elaborate than the human brain. That area is called the paralimbic region. So there is like an extra lobe of tissue that sort of sits adjacent to their limbic system and their neocortex. And you can infer from that lobe has something to do with processing emotions, but also has something to do with thinking. It's very highly elaborated in most cetaceans, and not at all or not nearly as much in humans or other mammals. So it suggests that there's something that evolved or adapted in their brain over time that did not occur in other mammals, including humans. So, right, yeah, in terms of cephalation, orcas, absolutely, they're just brilliant. I mean, many of you might know, orcas are my favorite animal. They're just fascinating. They have their own cultures. They teach very unique and very complex hunting techniques. This is sort of an intro before we talk about the ethics behind this, but for example, those in Patagonia will intentionally beat themselves to catch sea lion pups. It's a very elaborate technique that mothers teach their children. It's passed on through generations. Alternatively, we have documented evidence that orcas will kill and eat at least the livers of great white sharks. They do this they know what to do. They basically ram the shark from the bottom, turn it upside down, and do something called tonic immobility, which basically makes the shark drown, because sharks need to continue moving through the water in order for their gills to work. They're just incredibly complex. They stay with their families for life, I showed you, Colton, in that other video that it was clear that the orcas had a relationship with the man there.
Yeah,
it wasn't just random. So they look very alien, but it's clear that these, in some ways at least, they might be closer to us than say chimpanzees and gorillas in many ways, and yet they look too alien for us to infer from that we should treat them differently. We also have hard evidence that orcas kept in captivity actually live substantially shorter lives than in the wild. In the wild, they live up to 60 years or 80 years for males and females respectively. Much shorter, about 40% that in captivity. So I've come to the conclusion that it's totally unethical to have exhibitions like SeaWorld with marine life in general, but specifically with bottlenose dolphins and orcas and belugas as well. Really, any toothed whale we know has a very complex brain, they're neurologically very developed, and it's just psychologically devastating to them. Mothers and sons stay together their entire lives. They're not like human beings. So I don't know what one could do publicly other than not endorse it. I would never go to a SeaWorld exhibition, but it's just something, and this is evolving thought on my part. Years ago, when I was in my mid-20s, when I was living in Iceland, I decided to try whale meat. I believe it was minke whale. I don't think I'd ever do that again, just on sort of ethical grounds. Whereas, I don't have as much of an issue trying other types of meat. It's just when you look at neurological complexity as the basis for ethical concern, how much someone's capable of suffering, and you acknowledge, based on just neurological anatomical features, that a killer whale, in some sense, can suffer more than human beings because of a much more developed emotional connection, social connection to others of its pack, of its clan, then it's hard to find any. You can't really ethically justify, say, SeaWorld. Not that most people would. And whereas we talked about this briefly, a gorilla kept in captivity at a zoo is not suffering. It's kind of living the good life, to be honest.
Well, I think that's one of the big things about the difference, I think, between orcas and gorillas. I mean, orcas they travel like many miles in a day. The ethics of putting that animal into an Olympic-sized swimming pool for spectacle, not real good. Gorillas, I think, and other like great apes like chimpanzees, I believe, are much more sedentary. They tend to settle down in an area and then move on for foraging reasons.
And they live longer lives in captivity than in the wild, where you have the reverse case of dolphins and orcas. Well, orcas are dolphins. That's part of the argument, but it's also the fact that they're so developed emotionally that it just. I mean, if anyone has any understanding of how complex dolphins are, that they just shouldn't be a spectacle, I think.
Yeah, but I guess this is one of the things though where, again, I guess there's a spectrum on what works as far as zoos are concerned and what doesn't with different species. So orcas certainly don't. Gorillas. This is one of the big problems I have with PETA, the animal. Was it People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals? Their position is that no pets at all should exist, and that it's cruel to keep animals as companion animals for any sort of purpose. I actually think that's incredibly backwards. I mean, nature, for the most part, unless you're top of the food chain like the orcas are, nature is an incredibly harsh place to be. If I was a dog, for example, I would much rather be living in a house being hand-fed twice a day than basically living in the wild, having to...
Well, arguably a wombat as well, no?
Yeah, well, arguably. But yeah, I think there is a spectrum on... So gorillas, I think, zoo life is probably more suited to the way gorillas naturally kind of live in the wild. But it's much safer for them, and they're fed. They're actually fed each day. Orcas, not so much. There's animals in the middle as well. Like cheetahs, I think, are a good example where cheetahs they actually have quite a bit of difficulty breeding cheetahs in captivity, because part of the courtship ritual of cheetahs is running long distance with the mate. And a lot of the time they can't do that in captivity, therefore they don't mate in captivity.
Right, but that's not... I mean, cheetahs, you mentioned that sort of middle spectrum. Cheetahs are neurologically not as complex
they're
as
neurologically
or dolphins.
Not as complex. I'm just saying on a spectrum of how close zoo life is to what they are naturally suited towards. Gorillas, I think, for the most part, like gorillas in captivity, I think is a different scenario to orcas in captivity. But it does become interesting from the standpoint that you mentioned before you actually started recording the joke.
Oh, right. So, the minute you grant chimpanzees human rights, you also grant them the right to end up in jail, right?
So, again, I think if we look at it as gorillas being an endangered species, zoo life and zoo breeding programs may be good, but it's also the ethics of if they are granted personhood, you are essentially locking these people up for, their own good, I guess.
Yeah, in some sense. I mean, gorillas, by the way, are essentially gentle giants. Chimpanzees, common chimpanzees, are exceptionally violent.
Yeah, well,
by way of comparison.
Yeah, they
in fact, I think
war on each other.
Oh yeah, if it had been a question of chimpanzee versus, I think it actually would have been far more justified to shoot a common chimpanzee than the gorilla. Mm-hmm. We know from hard evidence. Silverbacks really only get aggressive if they think their harm is directly threatened, and I don't think the evidence was there that the child was threatening the silverback's harm.
Yeah.
Whereas common chimpanzees, there was a chimpanzee a couple of years back that literally bit off a woman's face to the point where she has no eyes. You don't want to get anywhere, and they're super strong too. You don't want to get near common chimpanzees. They're meat eaters as well. They hunt they viciously hunt other primates, monkeys.
Yeah. Well, even each other. I was watching probably about a month ago. I was watching an Attenborough documentary where one group of chimpanzees basically went and raided another group of chimpanzees, and it was incredibly violent. And they actually, once all the fighting died down, they'd killed a younger chimpanzee from the other group, and they actually cannibalized him. Which is fairly
well, and it's interesting that's one of the reasons why we're more similar behaviorally to chimpanzees than gorillas. Gorillas are just sort of chill. They're hanging out there. They're munching on their leaves. Termites are the only meat items that they'll eat on occasion, or ants. But chimpanzees we have a lot in common with chimpanzees. Raiding, fighting, on occasion cannibalism. It's quite remarkable. But in that case, you don't. So it gets really complicated. We're talking about species within I guess we say taxa. Gorilla probably was not a threat, but a male common chimpanzee, shoot that thing on the spot probably. But I just don't think the public is. We're all talking hypotheticals here. People are not going to take the time to experience, to investigate cetacean brains and neurological complexity, the differences between the common chimpanzee and I believe it was a western lowland gorilla. People are not going to do that. It strikes me as, we can hypothesize all we want, and I certainly enjoy doing that, but people this is time and again the perennial problem, is it not? Operating on an autopilot, on pure instinct, my kid, my child, motherhood.
As I said before, we can't even sort out like a fair legal system within our own species. When it comes down to it, it's like, primary aggressor laws to protect the women's.
And I think this was obviously an instance of a woman getting a woman, and to be specific, getting away. Hell, the father who wasn't even present was being blamed. Allegedly he had some criminal background. I haven't really looked into it, but the fact of the matter is she was there in front of or next to her children. She should have been taking care of them in that instant and preventing the child from slipping into the zoo. At the very least, the Cincinnati Zoo should be charging her, I think, a fine. Although, even that might be a bad PR move for the purposes. It's funny how much PR just dominates our society. So many things that are ethically complex and really would require greater scrutinization just fall by the wayside because people need their PR. My public relations,
Yeah, well, I don't know if you've watched it yet. He only put it out today, but Tildeer did an excellent video today about the fact that...
No, I've not yet watched it.
Yeah, it's a phenomenally good video. I think it's probably one of the best I've seen of his in quite a while, and that's saying something.
May the servant be praised.
His videos are really good, but this one in particular was sort of about this nonsense with the Ghostbusters video, and the fact that, like the new Ghostbusters film, and the fact that misogyny, or not even misogyny, but like this sort of innate sort of protect the women's instinct is now actually being used as a marketing strategy of Hollywood, where they'll put out a movie, and any criticism against the movie can be basically written off as misogyny. You just hate the movie because it's got a female cast. So it's all like it's almost being turned into a marketing strategy.
Well, look, let's be honest. I mean, I think it was Christopher Hitchens, the late great Christopher Hitchens, who said that women aren't funny, and he backed that up with evidence. Women don't need to be funny.
No.
Putting Ghostbusters, the original one, and by the way, guys, as a resident of New York, I was subjected to the falling debris of the State Puff Marshmallow Man as they were filming in the 80s. Can you believe that? Seriously, I was walking by along Central Park, and I literally caught some of the foam with my mother. Anyway, that aside, yes, I mean, the original Ghostbusters was humorous. It was funny. It had a star cast, certainly all male. The whole notion of girl power, when you sort of insert it into a film that's meant to be sort of a combination of action and humor, it's probably going to fail. There's a reason why there's certain male specialties, and humor is one of them. Another one would be athletic performance. I mean, yes, people watch female tennis and female football or whatever, but let's be honest, it's not nearly as competitive as other areas. And I think humor, men don't vet women on the basis of their ability to make them laugh. Do they have nice tits and ass, symmetrical face? That's kind of all that matters at the end of the day. Nice hair.
See, I don't even think, like in the case of Ghostbusters, I don't even think it's even comes down to that. I know it's ridiculous that this is even a controversial thing to say, but it would be in mainstream media. Men and women are different, and they bring different.
You don't say.
Men and women, like if you have a male character and a female character, whether you like it or not, their gender brings certain characteristics to the story and that character.
Right.
And in the case of Ghostbusters, I mean, Bill Murray and Dan Aykroyd playing these out and out, these down and out, paranormal scientists. I don't need to see. I don't think switching those characters to female is going to add anything to the story. I don't think the story would work as well. And it goes the other way around as well. I don't think anyone really needs an all-male Sex and the City,
Right.
It's just like that's I can't.
Well, the concerns of, I think I watched one episode just to see what it was about. The concerns in that show were not male concerns, typically.
No.
They were sort of the eternal vanity of the female, and I'm not satisfied. I need a new boyfriend, and this and that, and my career, and all this other. I mean, the standard modern concerns of the modern female, which are a little different than older ones, but still.
Yeah, which is completely fine, and there's people that love that show, but I don't see why they would turn around and try and reboot Sex and the City with an all-male cast. And by the same token...
Well, they wouldn't.
Well, they wouldn't, but by the same token, there seems to be this strong push to have, a female Thor and a female... There's actually been quite a... And I mean, it's quite... I like the show, but it is... you got to admit it is quite SJW friendly, but there's been quite a long push for a while to have a female Doctor Who. And I'm like, that would be terrible, because part of the whole thing with Doctor Who is, he's not even human, but he's essentially a man, and he always has
male inquisitiveness.
Yeah.
I mean, you see this meme throughout sort of Hollywood films, is these things that are just, yes, it's statistically possible, but so unlikely. Some sort of particle nuclear physicist female who's an expert and can save the world, or an expert computer code cracker. I mean, how many women are actually like that? Now, it is true, I believe, and I'll be making a video in the not-too-distant future on this, I think in fiction anything goes, but there are certain elements of realism that actually lend credence to a fictional setting more than just inserting absurdities into something, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, you need to have it grounded in some type of reality. Right. I think that's largely why, people have their own subjective opinions. Personally, I liked The Labyrinth a lot better than The Dark Crystal, for example. Even though they were both Jim Henson fantasy films, it was a lot harder to empathize with the puppet character, like the main puppet character in Dark Crystal versus Jennifer Connelly being a human in Labyrinth. It was easier to kind of it was just easier to empathize with the main character. If you go too far out there with your fantasy fiction, you can lose you can lose the audience. Like, they don't feel like they what's the word? The audience doesn't feel like they associate with the world.
Yeah. I think it's a complex issue, and I do want to cover this in a separate video, but so much of, we're kind of off topic a bit, but the whole women empowerment thing, having women in for the sake of women, look, Hollywood doesn't care either way, whatever makes you a buck, right?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, that's what it comes down to. But getting back to the main concern of the ethics here, I want to talk actually specifically in a separate video about sort of the ethics of fiction, but it just strikes me as the biggest problem to any sort of legitimate and well thought out discussion is always going to be political correctness and PR. Hell, the whole thing with Sargon, with the sort of anti-egalitarianism and all that other nonsense, having to run a perpetual PR campaign is going to be, it interferes so much, and I just wish people could get away from that and get away from their very strange sensibilities and sensitivities.
I guess that's sort of the issue, though, is that this particular PR campaign actually stems from an innate instinct. Like, if the zoo was to turn around and basically start loudly saying in all the media, it's the mother's fault, this gorilla's dead, she should be investigated, we'll be suing her for the damage she's caused to the zoo, we're going to recommend that child services, have a look at the home life to see if she's actually can care for these children. That would essentially rub people the wrong way. Everyone would sort of look at that, and from an ethical standpoint, that is probably what should happen. But from a biological standpoint, everyone's going to see this corporate zoo picking on the poor mama bear whose baby was in trouble.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
This PR campaign of poor mama bear. It's not. I don't think it's a. And this is something that we've all sort of talked a fair bit about. This idea that it's all the cultural elites, the cultural Marxists that have engineered everything. It comes from biology. You're essentially this PR, this politically correct public relations standpoint comes from our innate.
Well, yeah, and as we draw this discussion to a close, I want to point out that in my reasonably recent video, the conflict of moral interest, one of the, we can debate whether it's sort of a moral aspect of things or not, but women are much more concerned about not offending, obviously. And look at where society has gone in the last few decades. We've become a society that is literally tripping over its own feet in order to not offend people. Where does that come from? Men don't care. Yeah. My friend Brecht, that I had the discussion in the Netherlands, we both play a fair bit of Overwatch, and we're having a discussion with about a particular character, whether she's overpowered or not. And, it was fairly heated, and I think I got the feeling that the female that we were playing with felt really uncomfortable in that sort of setting, and just sort of reminded me of, this is very much a female-driven thing, whether it's ethically, the ethics are not aside, just this. Let's not offend people, and it's crippling us because we can't have a legitimate discussion, debate about really anything in the public sphere without worrying about PR. Imagine, let's just say all of that didn't exist. I think and the Cincinnati Zoo tranquilized the gorilla and everything. So they said we made this decision based on the calculations of primatologists and observations, blah, blah, blah. It turned out okay. Everything was fine. I think most men would have been cool with that, right?
Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, if you could actually put, frame it in those terms where I think what happened was the care-based moral outcome, the poor child, whereas a justice-based outcome would be the gorilla's not particularly threatening, the mother hasn't paid attention, the kid's got in there, the gorilla's not doing anything, the gorilla's an endangered species, we take, we tranquilize the gorilla, and it's possible, there is a risk that there may be harm done to the child, but ultimately that would, the fault for that should fall on the negligent mother. I mean, that would be the justice-based thing. You wouldn't, in a justice-based decision, you wouldn't just arbitrarily shoot the gorilla on the off chance.
Yeah, and it also interferes with the efficient running of a zoo.
Yeah.
Like I said, the gorilla is property of the zoo, and yet the child was essentially trespassing, and by extension the mother, because she wasn't taking care of her ward, as it were. Yeah, I can definitely see that along those lines. But we just see how crippling it's been throughout society. You can't even have a discussion because, my feelings and my care-based ethics interfere with everything and trump everything. It's, I'm really growing to loathe what society is turning into. I think one of the reasons why we're just making so little progress, at least publicly on the scientific front, when it comes to sort of biological and neurological awareness, making public this type of knowledge is all of this political correctness, which is ultimately, I think, stemming from female nature. Yeah. It's a shame. I would say I don't know what to do to stop it.
I would say male nature as well, unfortunately.
It seems of course.
Like both sides are primarily concerned with protect the women's. In this case, protect the children. Won't somebody think of the children? Basically, was the thought process in this gorilla shooting.
I think you less so than I, but we're both somewhat freakish in this because we can actually step outside of this bubble of thought and think, well, what are the actual ethics involved? What is the likelihood the gorilla would do this?
Yeah.
But I personally see children. I look at them and I generally, I feel nothing. In fact, they annoy me. So there's nothing appealing about children to me in particular.
Yeah. Well, I guess, the issue is that a lot of people just can't see past that's the whole thing, is like talking to these women, there's only so much I can say to people that aren't sort of red pill, that aren't familiar with the red pill and think of these kind of ethical outcomes. But yeah, they all seem to fall back on the, if it was my kid, I'd shoot the gorilla myself without a second thought. I guess they don't. If you were to bring up some of the things that we've talked about this evening, like even though we haven't really gone into a lot of the really in depth to it, but they would hear a lot of that as basically in their brain it would translate to so you think it's okay to let the child die. That is what they would hear. I can't remember, was it Aristotle or Socrates who said that the mark of a great mind is the ability to entertain an idea without necessarily subscribing to it.
I don't recall, but it's certainly which one it was. It certainly is a wise statement.
Yeah, but it just seems to be being able to hypothetically entertain an idea without necessarily subscribing to it is.
I think Teilhard lamented this in your fairly recent chat with him, that you can't hypothesize about things on the internet without you being described as a kind of, or without someone describing to you a devotion to that idea, but.
Yeah, after pages and pages of prefacing it that, oh, this is a generalization, it's a hypothetical.
Yeah, it'll never end, unfortunately. Anyway, I think we covered most of the basis. Obviously, there's a lot more depth to this, and I have considered making a video, because it's a personal interest of mine, on the sort of neurology and the ethics of cetaceans. I doubt many people would be interested, but based on, I guess, feedback and responses here, if there's interest in that, I certainly would go ahead and do that, because I find it fascinating. But yeah, an unfortunate incident, and once again, an issue that demonstrates that, emotion and care-based morality and just sort of women folk and children folk will always trump justice and reason, at least in the current state of affairs. Any final comments you'd like to add, Coltane?
No, I think we've covered most of what we were planning to cover.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much for tuning in on this not-so-fine Sunday afternoon. I say this because of the heat. It is summer here. Coltane is the beneficiary of being a southern hemisphereite, so I envy him in this.
That said, our winters are probably warmer than your summers.
Yes. I guess New Zealand would be more preferable in that sense. But you mentioned you're working on a new video that is due out in a reasonably soon time, or not too distant future. Yeah,
I'm just kind of waiting for a new microphone to arrive. After upgrading to Windows 10, my M-Audio N-Box stopped working. So
yeah, that happened to me too. But I think you'll be pleased with the model. I'm well familiar with it. Anyway, everyone, thanks for tuning in, and there will be more to come, as always, assuming I'm alive and not homeless and all that other jazz. You take care and enjoy your weekends wherever you might be, and we all look forward to Coltane's work. Bye-bye.
Catch you later.
If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.